If I survive this, I'm going to kill him. It wasn't a charitable thought, but Kellark wasn't feeling very forgiving. Alright, fine. So she'd set the press conference so all the reporters could watch a live edition of Meet the Imperium. It was a respected show. Leonri Trelandi was one of the top reporters on Shill, an award-winning journalist. If she and Bree were going to stand out in the cold holding a press conference, why not air the show for them first? Let someone else do the heavy lifting and ask the hard questions. Then she could follow through with an easy question and answer session, showing everyone that Professor Warwick was really just a normal person, for a human. At least her press release hadn't been changed, except for the byline. Siraskisi, the Adexi who'd been given final review, had punched it up a little, insisting it was perfectly tame compared to what she was used to. Lark considered going back to the head administrator, but what if Lady Garnier thought she couldn't handle things? At least the story hadn't been changed. Anyone just reading it would see that everything was all perfectly straightforward. Aside from an attack on children, well, young adults really, the students at a school, that sort of thing just didn't happen. Well, that, and the beheading, aside from that, it was normal. Well, the attack at the school, the beheading, of a Shorvanti admiral by a human. The attack, the beheading, the human, and the princess she couldn't mention. Aside from that, everything was perfectly fine. She'd always prepared for a day like this. Being the lead reporter, running a press conference with a big story at her fingertips. It was everything she'd hoped for professionally. She was a trained professional. She should not feel like throwing up. Or passing out. Or both. She painted a smile on her face and turned to the podium, looking out over the sea of waiting faces, video cams at the ready. I'm sure you'll all agree that was very informative. She tried to make it sound like a statement. It sounded more like a question, and she wasn't sure who she was asking. The day was brisk. Dark clouds turned the late afternoon into an early twilight, and it looked ready to rain again. It was the kind of day no one should be out in. Instead, there must have been 60 or 70 people hanging on the moment. After all, there were only 40 chairs set out, and it looked like... Bree's voice reached her over the monitor in her ear. Babe, stop stalling. Bree had helped her set up. When the crowd started coming in, she'd had the sense to grab an earpiece for them both. If she wasn't facing a sea of reporters, a large pond, at least, she could have answered back. I am not stalling. Someone coughed politely in the front row. Alright, she was stalling. It was the moment. She forced herself to smile again and braced herself. So, are there any questions? Arku felt like he was drowning in a bottomless sea. He wanted to die. It had to be what the deep felt like. An endless empty blue that turned to black, reaching up beneath you. Drifting in the breathless void for all time. Cold, black, and unforgiving as the light faded and you floated down, drifting in an eternal emptiness. Even the airless void of space had stars. The deep was blackness without light, adrift without hope, until even the sense of up and down was a memory. That was his life. The Cliffside Theatre in Proandi sector was one of the nicest on Shill, outside of the capital. Deep in the southern hemisphere, it was the perfect place to start his tour. The evening was warm, the air was sweet with the scent of acanthra flowers, and the setting sun had backlit him perfectly. He'd given the show everything he had, mustering every ounce of his craft and pouring his soul into every note. He'd finished the show with a heart-rending ballad to the dying light as the sun set on the horizon, and accepted the applause, spent but happy. Mistress Tranja hadn't even waited until he was back in his room before shredding his performance. She went over every segue, every move, and every note without mercy. Nothing he'd done was right, The way he'd improvised the transition between the third movement of Helana's Rainfall Suite and Rovalda's Ode to Twilight wasn't even one of the prescribed forms. Her review had lasted almost an hour. This was only the first show on a 3-week tour, and it had felt like an eternity. Aku had cradled his head and rocked in his chair. He wasn't sure how long that had gone on. He was mentally exhausted, but his mind wouldn't let him go. How could it? The whole thing was impossible. In desperation to think about something else, anything else, he'd pulled out the files Kamara and Kazlan had sent him. They were good friends, but how could he explain what his life was like? The pressure of it all. He wasn't just a cliff singer's apprentice, he was a boy. If he didn't inherit his mistress's title, performing would be out of the question, unless it was in some tiny drawing room as a trophy husband. Real music would be taken away. Languishing in dark obscurity for the rest of his life, yawned before him, just like the deep. There were 2 films there, and in desperation he started the first one. It took his mind a few minutes to grasp that it was a period piece, but it seemed so appropriate to the moment that he nearly broke down into tears. The costuming was so elegant, so very like something he would wear. The wigs were odd, but the music was beautiful. The film started with the creeping verdict of an elderly musician, growing foul with anger and rage. It stained his soul with hate and jealousy, an abiding anger that had begun with their first meeting. All over what? Daring to improvise on a melody? It ended with death and destruction. The twisted character of Salieri would have gotten along perfectly with Mistress Tranja. She'd be happy to bury him just for improvising an opening. Where was his music? What would survive him that he'd written? Nothing. Apprentices didn't create. He would simply disappear. He was nothing. He wouldn't even get the last laugh, like Amadeus. His soul felt scraped, raw, beaten, and battered like a ship hung on a reef. All that remained was to be smashed into pieces. Sleep was an impossible dream, and he moved sluggishly, the desolation washing over him. There was still the second film, and he pulled up the file, setting it running. Another dead musician. Was that the way of things for humans? Did they burn so brightly that they flared and died like comets? It seemed like so many of the new heroes he was coming to love were gone. The songs he'd gotten from the girls at the academy were like rays of light through the bars of a cage, but even if some of his new heroes were dead, their music lived on. And wasn't that the point? Humans didn't hold themselves back, practicing perfect forms. They didn't hide away like priestesses in a temple. They let the music breathe. They let it live. Why couldn't he be allowed to do that? It was past 2 in the morning when the second film ended, and he closed down the viewer. There were weeks to go, and this had only been the first night. He didn't even want to die. He just felt numb. Eddie and the Cruisers had been fun in parts. The music was glorious, and yet the story seemed incomplete. It left the people he loved and left behind haunted and hurting. There were so many things I wanted to say to him, so many questions I wanted to ask. But Eddie and I, we had a deal. We never talked about the future. We thought the present was so fine. Why ruin it by planning ahead? But as Eddie drove off, I knew. I knew it then. There wasn't going to be any future. In the morning they told me Eddie was gone, and they hadn't found his body. The idea of a singer reaching for the top of his field, only to throw it all away and fake his death, it was just ridiculous. Wasn't it? Clip stared up through the crowd at the little bitch behind the podium, and her anger festered. It was bad enough being out on a day like this, but she took a smug satisfaction watching the other newswomen around her suffering. There were 2 things she learned to cherish and take perfect care of: her camera and a good set of all-weather clothing. What a load of lightweights. Like any of them have had the guts to lurk in a dark alley to catch Orica Okavi sneaking out of a club with her latest boy toy, or binging on papaya after touting her new diet book. Would they chase across town after a hot tip on the emergency lines, just to catch a hot celeb boy puking his guts out? Pure gold. If they were an A-lister, it was still a solid 4 figures. No. She spotted some of her competition in the crowd, but most of the newsies here were pampered bitches with network jobs. Not that it mattered. Every picture was a trophy, and she wanted that human's head on her wall. The problem was the prissy bitch up on the podium. She had a rocky start, but somehow she quickly came into her own. It didn't make sense. She was just a noble's brat and should have folded under the pressure. Maybe it was just that air of confidence they all had. Clips had taken down bigger nobles. No school brat was going to hold her off. Most of the network cunts had softballed their questions anyway. She held up her hand, smiled pleasantly, and waited. Your question, ma'am? She couldn't help being a little smug in front of her peers as she stood up. Pavis Kosreen, Independent News. This was her one shot at the academy, and she gave the expected pause after her name before diving right in. After beheading Admiral Tajo in a rage, the only word Professor Warwick has to say is, gotcha. What's the Academy's position on having such a murderous savage on its faculty, and when is he going to come forward to answer questions directly from the press? The little rich bitch had the nerve to toss her long black hair back and smile. I would offer that Professor Warwick was on the ground bleeding to death at the time in question. I'm sure he was pleased to have saved the lives of his students from the woman trying to kill them. Regardless, we all just watched him live on Meet the Imperium. I think we can all agree that asking a wounded male to stay here in the cold would be an unsupportable hardship, and that Professor Warwick has gone out of his way to be transparent in the wake of his terrible injuries. The newsies had all stirred at her question. That kind of question put blood in the water, and all she should have to do was wait. There were 100 reporters against one schoolgirl. It was a wonder the kid even had tits. She wasn't even 6 feet tall. Even if the answer was a lot more polished than Clips had expected, she still just needed to give one more push. That just reveals his state of mind, though. Parents want accountability. The general public has a right to... This matter has been investigated by Princess Indara Tasu, personally. The little cunt actually cut her off. Clips couldn't believe it. She's visited the campus to express the concern of the royal court and oversaw a full investigation. If you don't want to take the Academy's statement at face value, I believe you can contact the palace for further details. But... Next question. She'd had it. She'd had the momentum to turn the damn conference on its ear and make everyone see that Warwick was just a dangerous psychopath. She could already see the picture she'd take as he was led off the campus in chains. She sat down without thinking about it. Shut down by someone who hardly looked 10 years old. The tenor of the conference changed back, going out like the tide. Dropping Indara's name had been a power move, and the little twat had saved it for just the right moment, as if she knew what she was doing all along. That was fine. So much for getting what she wanted from the Academy. Warwick had them all fooled. Warm rage bubbled inside her, like the feeling of eating grassy leftover papayas. It was satisfying at the time, but it wouldn't go away. She'd make them see. Who cared about Indara? Everyone knew that royal bitch usually disappeared off on her yacht to fuck her personal boy toy. Another human. Clips had a way inside a different palace, all her own. Zin Shiki turned the video off. Her eyes shone as she ran her tongue along the fur of her right hand, before teasing her tongue over one claw thoughtfully. It wasn't fair, but at least there was some hope. She was a Pezrin. She knew how to properly muriask her chathat when she walked, showing just the right sway in her tail. She could recite the 20 kahachakt. She knew her family line for 10 ancestors and could sing their deeds. She knew her place in the Great Hunt. That's what made it so unfair. She was a Pezrin. She should be out among the stars, practicing the traditions of a warrior. She had already proven she was tough enough for the trials. But no, the pride mothers of her family warband had decided to accept a contract with Duchess Eliana as her personal bodyguard. Alright, technically she wasn't at home on Pesh, but she wasn't in space. To be honest, even she had to admit the money was just too good to pass up. But that left her stranded here, on Shill, where the light was always too bright, and at her age, the local customs meant she was legally forced to go to school. She loathed school. Even if the Duchess herself assured her pride mothers that it was well regarded, what they taught was useless. Devoted to the trades, as if that was fitting for a warrior. It was humiliating. There was almost nothing for what Shilvanti considered the liberal arts. There was barely a music curriculum, though that would be humiliating. What kind of deeds would her granddaughter sing? How Zin Shiki Green Eyes once taught the wild classrooms of beginning accountancy. The best she'd been able to manage was a history class, where she could occasionally glean something useful. Still, it just made her want to spit. The Shilvanti were big, lumbering, and slow. Powerful if they got their hands on you, but what self-respecting Persian would allow that to happen? She was no mewling kid, sucking at her mother's teat. She'd proven she was tough enough to be an adult. Ready for the Hutch Parara, where she'd make her kill, showing her warband she was tough enough to take a male. She was ready to sing out the eternal cry of her people, screaming the chirawal of formal challenge. Zin Shiki sighed. At least there were some aliens on the planet worthy of hunting. A human who beheaded an admiral with his long claw. An elder, too. That was honourable. Not that she was likely to meet anyone like that, stuck at Soche Pan Technical. Tanu stared up at the clocks on the wall. Lined up in a neat row were digital readouts of the local time, major provincial capitals around Earth, and fleet time. Fleet time knew no limits. The rotation of a planet around its day and night cycle was meaningless to a ship in space. At some point, endless centuries ago, someone decided fleet time would run concurrently to the capital on Shill. The odds were high that it was the invention of some bureaucrat. Not that the Navy didn't run an around-the-clock operation, but ship captains tended to gravitate towards being up during the day cycle. That meant more dispatches during the day, and less being woken up in the middle of the night. Politics being what it was an unwritten tradition that planetary capitals, as hubs of information and commerce, were generally selected along the same time zone. On Earth, that would have meant putting the system capital in Nuuk, Greenland. Wiser heads had prevailed. Fortunately, the eventual choice was only a few hours off of fleet time. His late afternoon was only modesty into the fleet's evening. Back home in the capital, people would be finishing their dinners. His family would be going through the usual rituals, making sure the children had brushed their tusks, and... Tanu's desk omni chimed at the same time as Axia's. She was off in the bathroom, and he turned to his desk. Imperial dispatches were usually missives or requests for specific information, and as he pulled up the message base, his eyes grew wide. 2 new messages sat waiting in his queue. Both were marked Code Mauve. A message at that level usually meant direct involvement by the palace, and in his entire career he'd seen 3 of them pass through. Now he had 2, both routed for his office's personal attention. That meant special delivery, rather than running it to its destination for the datanet, either routing the message with separately sent encryption keys, or actual old-fashioned hand delivery on paper. Code Mauve meant that the messengers were provided a need-to-know access. There were a host of reasons, running from taking a return message, to the arrest of the recipient. Typically, news traveled by regular traffic that dropped into any system. After dropping into orbit, a ship's dedicated server would handshake with the system's traffic control, perform an update, and be updated in return. Unless you were in a system without much traffic, the news was generally current to within a few weeks. Regular traffic took time, however, and the news was only as complete as traffic allowed. The messages sitting on his console had arrived by fast courier, which made them another matter entirely. Even at superluminal speeds, velocity remained a function of energy against mass. Courier ships were stripped down until they were barely more than an engine and a pilot. Built purely for speed, they served as the long arm of the Empire. Orders that would normally require weeks or months across the vast expanse of imperial space were delivered in days to weeks. Orders usually given by Fleet Command or the Imperial Court. Word had reached Earth only a few weeks ago over the death of Princess Calandri, and the Empress's choice to depart with the court and bring her remains home. It was traditional. Yet somehow, Princess Indara Tassu must have been left behind, leaving her in charge. These messages were effectively the will of the Empress, or near enough as to make no difference. Regardless of its difficulties, Earth was hardly the bright center of the galaxy. For something to attract the attention of the throne and dispatch a courier, it had to be time-critical. The information on his terminal was less than a month old. There might be messages from home, and even now the local news network was being updated on events back on Shill, but there was time to catch up on the news later. He peered at the first message, looking over the routing instructions, and shook his head in astonishment. It seemed so mundane. The recipient of this year's Imperial Science Award was someone right here on Earth. A human institute, of all things. He leaned his chin on his hands, reading it through a second time, then a third. He could tease out no reason for its special designation, given the information presented. The priority rating stated the message had time-critical delivery, but that was all, and he flagged it for secure delivery. Wherever the Painter Institute was, there would be a field agent or military outpost nearby. While a significant honor, it hardly seemed like material for Code Merv. Encrypted delivery with confirmation would do. Tanu pulled up the next message and ran his eyes over the routing instructions and paused, delicately bringing his hand to his mouth and holding back a gasp. The dispatch came from the Ministries of Justice and the Interior, and was directed to Alea, by way of their office, a job for hand delivery. Since Alea was a governess in the North American sector, there were no alternatives. While Axia hated seeing her under the best of circumstances, the content surely had to be vital to Imperial interests. Taking a deep breath, he pulled open the courier information and began to read. Tanu felt a smile tug at his lips. A moment later, he had to stifle a giggle. It was so rare to be in the presence of... what was the human word? Karma? It was so very rare to be in the presence of karma when it struck on such a grand scale. It felt like the air had grown thin, leaving him giddy. Hey, I just ran into Jadri out in the hall. She says there's a new Indian buffet in town. Want to hit it up for dinner? Axia shut the door behind her and was halfway to her desk before looking his way. Catching his expression, she looked herself over. What? Tanu giggled. After watching the autocab pull out from the drive, Tom swiped the doorpad gratefully, letting himself inside. A whole week off campus. A whole week teaching at Soshipan Technical. Well, what there was to teach. He still didn't have any idea how to make a few meager notes stretch 5 hours, but he could make do. On the bright side, it was a whole week at Miz's place off in town. A whole week alone with Shalea. That had its perks. Miv was Miv. She had a heart big enough to take your shattered world in, pick up the pieces and leave you feeling whole. She was thoughtful, intelligent, and had a quirky sense of humour that might or might not be because she was Shovanti. She'd opened herself up to him, without tackling him like a marine on her first date. She was wonderful, and as the weeks turned to months together, it was easy to see why he'd fallen in love with her. Shalea, on the other hand, well, she and Miv were a package deal, of course. It was easy to see that anyone Mivere had clung to for so many years had to have something going for her, and she did. Leia wasn't a noble. Shorter than Miv, she was slim and lithe. She worked hard, she was earthy, funny in a way that was sometimes tart, insightful. She seemed like an old soul, and when Miv had come out like the sunrise, Leia had opened herself up to him like a flower. She'd been just as hurt as Miv, and she'd been cautious. Falling for each other had been a careful process for them both, but that hadn't made it any less sweet. No, spending a whole week with Shalea was a perfect reward. "Lucy, I'm home." Nah, she'd never get it. Setting his omnipad down on the table by the door, he dropped his suitcase. The house was big. It had been intended as a Shovanti idea of a perfect place for any upwardly mobile noble to start a family. That was starting with a family of 4. The 2 of them would rattle around in the place, but it was comfortable. Miv's house wasn't what it used to be, apparently, but she still kept this place. It had a long view along the coast, and the master bedroom looked down over the windswept sea. A week here was no hardship tour by any means. The house was large, open, and natural light swept through the twisting halls Shovanti seemed to love. Ah well. He raised his voice and called out, "Leia, I'm here." He heard Leia call back from up the hall, "Tom, we're in the gallery." Okay, so they had company. It wasn't like he'd been here long enough to know Leia's habits. No one was alone all the time. For Shovanti, the idea would be intolerable. She must have neighbours. Ah well. They had the week together, and Tom made his way up the hall. Leia was there in the gallery, looking out over the garden. So were 3 other women. 3 other elderly women, who were all naked. They all turned as one to regard him with gleaming smiles. "Why, hello!" There was that feeling again. The one where life reached out and clubbed you with a leg of lamb so large Fred Flintstone would be happy. He swallowed as the one nearest Leia stood up and beamed. She looked a lot like her, and she raised both hands and cried, "There's our future son-in-law!" Yep, totally naked. Tom tried to catch Leia's eye, but it was impossible, as all 3 women rose and made their way over. This isn't happening. This is not happening. Dazedly, he offered up a fist just as the second woman, somewhat shorter than the first and a bit more generously endowed, pressed past and wrapped her arms around him. "Oh, please, we don't bump fists with the man giving us our first grandchild. Come here and give us all a hug." The third had made her way over, blocking any view of Leia as she reached up and mused his hair. "You're a tall one, aren't you? Leia didn't say." "That's right." Elder Leia had wrapped her arms around his other side and was pressing in. "But when she told us you were here the whole week, we decided we could forget the retreat and really get to know you." Kill me. Tanu seldom lost his sense of poise. The demands of his work were constant, and while Axia was a wonderful partner with a pure heart, sometimes she desperately needed looking after. It usually wasn't more than he could handle. Just now, he'd come to love the Bogart films. They were so utterly delightfully human. The most instructive of all had to be Casablanca. Shifting alliances, criminals and police, all set against a backdrop of contending empires. Love and loss, treachery and honor. It was so wonderfully instructive into the human mind. He didn't settle into his chair so much as slide into it with a thump, before drawing a short breath, letting it out with a sniff. I didn't think Alea could get that mad. Axia? And Tanu looked over at his partner. She looked, what was the human word? Bemused? Flummoxed? No, that wasn't it. She looked as stunned as he felt, and yet, somehow, content. Perhaps it didn't matter. Per the regulations for Code Mauve, they'd deliver the news in person. He'd even taken a bit of pleasure in the whole thing. Alea was a difficult woman, and her relationship with his partner was rocky at the best of times. While he'd never spoken to her about it, he was more than a little convinced their second posting to Earth had been Alea's request. As close relations, the woman seemed to delight in petty shows of authority. Axia lacked any title beyond her rank in the interior. As her sister, she seemed to be Alea's perfect victim, which made things rather interesting. Tanu raised an eyebrow. A hunch flared inside him. Axia, exactly how much money do you think this court order will cost her? Axia's state of amusement started to crumble before his eyes. Axia, I've been through any number of trials at your side. If a magistrate were thinking of awarding repayment plus, let's say, marginal reparations... Tanu leaned forward, making sure to wait until she looked up. His eyes narrowed as he stared at her. How much? Expressions chased themselves over his partner's face. It was the kind of thing he usually saw when someone was hedging their answer. If it goes back more beyond her mother? According to the charges, it does. He ran one fingertip demurely along his chin. Beyond Alea to her mother, your co-mother, all the way to her grandmother? Given the way your sister spends money, I'm surprised there's anything left. So just how much are we talking about, roughly? At a guess? 30 million credits, maybe 40? 30 or 40 million credits, Tanu said slowly, before licking his lips. They suddenly felt dry. Well, now I know what all the fuss was about. I had no idea. Any trace of evasion was gone as Axia started to panic. She looked at him desperately, a pleading look as she wrung her hands. Really, I didn't. That was her co-mother. We practically didn't... It's all right. Relax. I believe you. He held up a hand, forestalling any more unnecessary protests. Goddess love her. After all these years, she was still his superior officer. But she was also his friend. Even if his judgment had somehow managed to fail him so utterly and spectacularly, if she'd had any under-the-table income from Alea, and the Deep would probably freeze solid first, then regular security verifications would have found it years ago. You're a good officer, and far too fine a person to be defrauding your favourite aunt. Thank you, Tanu. Axia seemed to slowly deflate in relief. I appreciate that. You're very welcome. That seemed to be that. The messages were delivered, and they could both put this sordid matter behind them. Tanu ran a hand back through his hair, and looked up at the clock. With a little luck, he could pick up something to eat on the way back to his rooms and pamper himself with a long bath. He'd earned it. Tanu, what's a floozy, anyway? Axia had perked up and was looking at him quizzically. It's just, when she was screaming and threw us out, she said I should get out and take my floozy with me. It's pronounced floozy, and it's not a nice word. Anyway, I'm a man in a woman's world. I have been called worse, he said nonchalantly. You couldn't be an agent of the interior if you let names bother you. He glanced up to see her leaning forward, grinning at him, and shook his head. It was just one of those days. Asshole. Ha! Floozy. As chief of security for the Painter Observatory, and everything that it had become over the years, Commander Rem was used to sudden outbursts. Occasionally they were accompanied by actual explosions, but never when she just handed Sammy a message. The years had been kind. Sammy was still a puff full of energy that defied description. If anything, they'd just gotten refined. Hee! I have to tell Sam! She watched Sammy take off for the door, lab coat flapping behind them. Whatever was in the message, at least it was good news. Stace looked up from the carving he was working on, as the sound Doppler shifted up the hallway, past his door and off down the hall. Pom was laying in the sunny spot on the floor. One ear might have twitched. He smiled affectionately. Pom had good sense. Whatever it was, a good nap was hard to beat. At least nothing had exploded. He'd hear about whatever it was soon enough. Sam, 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 you're never going to guess. Samuel Forsyth Painter smiled indulgently as the love of his life flew into the room. It was a question that never grew old, but when Sammy said you'd never guess, the odds are that they weren't wrong. Their life together was never boring. Pulling himself out behind the old control panel he'd been tinkering with, he smiled indulgently and brushed himself off. There was a flash of eyes as green as new leaves peering up at him under a yellow puffball of hair as Sammy flew over, hugged the life out of him, thrust a card in his hands and was off, dashing into their closet. We have to pack, grab people, get things. We'll get to see Akame again. Guessing seemed academic. It says we've just won the annual Imperial Science Award. They're naming some buildings after us too, but who cares about that? We can see Akame again. Their muffled voice came from the closet now, as clothing flew into the bedroom. There's also some boring stuff about a princess, assassins, and asking if we can help out. You know. Work? A what? Anyway, that doesn't matter. We've been invited to a party at the palace. Sammy leaned out from the closet with their best green scarf tied around their neck. We're going to kill it.